Oh, I'm delighted with it. Although I've been having a slightly fragmented time. My wife is unwell, so I'm running home all the time. But I think it's fabulous. And my student, Chris Kelly, and Annabella are our graduate students at the religion department. And I had been worried that they would be delayed on their way to their thesis if they got into organizing it, so I had caution to them. But they went ahead anyway, and I'm very glad they did. I think it's very good. And I particularly love it that it's in this Low library, very sort of auspicious and kind of in the center of academia, because these are discussions that academia should really be taking on. And our philosophy departments here are not doing it, and our science departments are not doing it. The Center for the Study of Science and Religion, under whose auspices it's taking place, is kind of like looked at really askance by the both philosophy and science people. And they're very nervous that and that it has such a large interest in the public, they take as a sign of, I don't know what, the apocalypse or something. So I'm very pleased about it. Okay. And also the engagement of what I consider the Buddhist scientists, philosophers, you know, the Buddhist, not religious people, but scientists, is also very crucial in my opinion. About the dialogues between the Buddhist scientists, as I would like to say, and the Western ones, I've been impatient for the next level in the mind and life thing for a long time. And that's because the way the mind and life thing has tended to go is you have the Western scientists and the Dalai Lama as a person, mainly. And then there's usually a few geishis and some other people, and then there's some people in between people like Alan Wallace and Thupten Jimba and myself, Hopkins, kind of people like that, and translators and also thinkers independently. But basically the idea is that Western science is so clever and so interesting, and Buddhists are so calm and cool and nice to get along with, and you have great insights around them, and they're in some unusual state that you want to find out how it works. But the Buddhist intellectual superstructure, you know, the philosophy, the rational approach to the nature of reality as a science, with the mutual peer sort of level of intellectual respect, has been absent actually. And the Buddhists are rather kind of research subjects. You know, like Richie Davidson work, issuing in Richie Davidson's fascinating work, because I'm not against that. I'm not saying that there's nothing wrong with that. That's very good. But there's another level where the hubris of the Western intellectual / scientist / philosopher comes to realize that there's some things that intellectually, rationally, critically, they haven't thought through that maybe the Buddhists thought through better. Not just as religion, or not just as being able to calm themselves and to contemplate, but actually in the form of intellectual theory, in the form of reasoning power, and common good sense, actually, in some way. So the level of where that, and then if they really got to that level, they would be interested in dialogues with people other than just the Dalai Lama. Mm-hmm. And they would really be putting their own philosophical views up to question. And in a way, I think this dialogue is the kind of thing the Dalai Lama would be very happy about, in the sense that it's not depending on him, it's not taking him to bring the people there, although a lot of people here from the Western side have already talked to him in the past and got interested that way, which is natural. But they're really engaged with the issues and thinking about it, and they're listening to Dreyfus and Wallace and me and Chris Kelly and other kinds of people like that. So that's the next level, I think, that it should go to. And it's a difficult level, you know. As I said, on this campus, the fact that philosophy people here have no tolerance for the religion people, and the science people don't want a dialogue with what they think of as religion. And what religion is in American campuses actually is non-Western philosophy, or even non-Anglo philosophy, you know, continental, like Heidegger, Wittgenstein, Nietzsche. They don't study that here. They consider that a bunch of weird hippies or something, you know, and they won't study it, you know. And so... that to me is the level that we have to get to, and this is getting to, and that's why I really like it. That's when the next level really begins. That's exactly the same thing. They're saying, well, people are just flipped out, the Dalai Lama is so amazing. And of course he adopts a stance, a very mild stance, where he really learns from the Westerners, and they come away saying they thought all kinds of new great things. But in a way they don't really learn from him, except by his person, you know. So there's nothing tangible. They don't listen to his instruction in a certain way, because their preconception is that the West has the intellectual goods, and the East has sort of stumbled on some phenomena, but they didn't really figure out why. They don't even know why they do it. The reason might be, I don't know of any of my colleagues who translate Buddhist philosophy into English, but such a project should involve such people, in the sense that they know the sort of philosophical, technical terms in the Buddhist philosophy, and then the things of the Western science and philosophy could sort of fit in a way where then those Tibetans could learn more in Tibetan. I would wager that the science for monks people who are sort of successful graduates of that program amongst the Tibetans are probably really thinking in English about the scientific things, and that whatever the effort to do it in Tibetan has not really gelled yet where it fits with their ability to think in Tibetan. And that's really crucial. And here I have to say, I have to express my own inabilities. The Dalai Lama for years has asked me, 20 years, why don't you stop translating Tibetan philosophy books into English and do me a favor and translate some science books into Tibetan and philosophy books? And, I've said, yes, I'll get to it type of thing, but then you get so busy, and somehow I've never had the funding to mount that kind of a project, but that is a very important project for the future of Tibetan culture, actually. And the organization that I head, which is Tibet House here, preserving Tibetan culture, a very key component of that is to translate Western books into Tibetan. Literature too, Shakespeare or whatever, plus, and most importantly, science books. Today in Tibet, young Tibetans who learn anything about science or modern science, they learn in Chinese and not in Tibetan. And so there's not been an effort to make these translated, and there should be. Actually, there is an organization, the Amnia Machen Institute, in Dharamsala. We did a little bit fund them from Tibet House, and it's supposed to be their job, but I think they don't have the enough funding. We can't fund them substantially enough. And also they are literary types. They're not philosophy or science types. But that's a big project we should really do. If we know anybody who would help us fund that, we would start doing that at heavy scale, and we would get the Buddhist philosopher translating types from Tibetan and from Sanskrit to help translating into Tibetan. It would be very, very important. What I would like to bring up is that the suggestion I made in my paper, which I hope was recorded, I don't know if they I hope they recorded everything. But anyway, what I suggested in my target paper, and I think it bears on what Alan Wallace is talking about very much, which I very much support what he's talking about, but strategically, I think that we have to make a bigger effort in Buddhist expressing the Buddhist philosophical side to elaborate what is you might call the Buddhist hermeneutic theory, elaborated from Nagarjuna's time, but very, very beautifully so by Tsong, that all theory is relativistic. There's no absolute theory, including the theory of karma, or including any description of the relative world. All descriptions of the relative world are just relativistic, and therefore there are zones of discourse where they're useful and zones where they're not. And that's similar to the Popperian notion of science that all laws of nature, so-called, are hypothetical or waiting falsifiability from further evidence. And that, if we have to show how Buddhism, with its theory of shunyata, of emptiness, is in the same ballpark. That's one. So therefore, two, instead of saying naturalism, instead of just attacking naturalism, without recognizing what naturalism is an attempt to challenge the church's control of thought in Europe a few hundred years ago. And the Enlightenment turning to naturalism was a way of trying to get the church out of the business of burning them at the stake, which they should be kept out of that business for sure. And so there's a reason for the naturalism, and therefore if you just challenge naturalism, then the people you're challenging think you're trying to bring back supernaturalism, and it's a hopeless thing. So instead, I think you have to attack the definition of naturalism and say that the Buddhists are thoroughly naturalistic, but within what they define as nature, the divine realm and other realms of life, and and karma, and all of these things are there, but it's nothing supernatural in how they define supernatural. That is to say, the idea of a God outside the universe, or any kind of absolute that is disconnected from relativity. In other words, even the speed of light would be considered by the Buddhists a kind of supernaturalism, making that an absolute, in other words. So I think strategically, and it's similar to my suggestion that, the mind and the rebirth thing can be addressed without positing a non-material entity that travels from life to life. It could be, we don't actually, when we get down to really trying to explain it in Tantra, in esoteric terms, we talk about an extremely subtle body-mind complex that goes, and the mind always is embedded in a body of wind, a body of neural energy or something like that, what you might call. And so there isn't this sort of materialist, spiritualist dichotomy. It is collapsed into a different kind of way of understanding. And I think that's a more fruitful way to go. And that pushes also the materialists back into the fact that Alan also brings up about how with the wave function collapse and the whole thing about the quantum paradoxes and, the fact that they've lost it, really. They don't know what matter is. So why are we fighting over, accepting their pretense that they know what matter is and then saying you have to have a non-material thing that we're going to force on you? That's hopeless. And where that comes from, His Holiness a little bit is in the same vein. That's why I think Alan does that. He feels strategically it's necessary. And His Holiness does it too. And it has to do with the fact that in Buddhist societies, the mind-body dualism and interactionism that Dharmakirti manifests is the exoteric way of teaching. Because it is believed that if people are told that mind is reducible to matter in any way, in the general public, then they will become nihilists about former and future life, and then they will become immoral and really destructive, the way that nihilists are. The way the modern industrial society is, actually, whether they admit it or not. And they act like they're great in helping the world, but they're actually destroying the world. And this was predicted in ancient India a long time back. So therefore, they're hesitant to go into their esoteric, where mind-body are non-dual, either as a mental phenomena, if that's useful in some case, or as a physical phenomenon, if that's useful in some case, doesn't matter. But the point is they're not really different. So therefore, the old dualistic mind-matter meaning in the exoteric realm is no longer useful. So in that light, it's much more fruitful. The scientists are like esoteric types because they're down in quantum reality and they're in these really realms of fantasy, really. So you have to deal with them, engage with them on that level, I think, rather than try to shove the exoteric teaching of dualism down their throat where it'll never go. Well, the reason I decided to press it more, and as I said in my talk, I was teasing Thupten Jimba in a talk 7 years ago in a hospital here with some medical neuroscience type of people with His Holiness there. I mentioned this point, and Jimba and His Holiness, Jimba was muttering in Tibetan to His Holiness, and they were going like this, and then His Holiness said, well, I agree with everything you said, as you said, he said to me, and then he said, except we better look out about this mind-body non-duality. Although he knows that I referred to the esoteric teaching that Lusem Zechig, or what they call Lungsem, wind, mind, indivisible, and wind is the subtle form of matter, or energy, mind, indivisible. And so because he and Jimba were like, don't say that in general type of thing, because it'll lead these people to be confirmed in their nihilism, and then that leaves them trapped in the idea that there's no spiritual horizon beyond what you can do in this life, and then it all comes to nothing, which is a way of removing your own energy for spiritual development from the exoteric point of view. And it will correspond. And it is also true, by the way, that I'm still, like in my debate with Batchelor, I'm very outspoken on the popular level with the determination that former and future life is essential. And actually, I argue that Darwinian evolution must be put in that light. And with Dennett, I challenge Dennett, or I'll challenge Owen or anybody, if they think they're like great evolutionary thinkers and they're therefore accepting their total embeddedness in nature, they all have a mind that doesn't exist. And therefore they're letting themselves out of being embedded in nature. Whereas the karma theory, as a physical theory, even at a subtle plane, keeps you completely embedded in nature, your soul in a way. There's no ability to indulge in the picture that your essence, if you shoot yourself, you're going to withdraw into a state of blank nothingness, a dark space, which is the picture the materialist has in mind. And that's how they think they get out of their connection on causes and effects of whatever it is. And they don't have moral causation following them, And that's what His Holiness is nervous about, and I agree with him. And therefore, I'm only being strongly arguing about the non-duality of mind and matter in this debate with the biology people, the Darwinian people, at the same time as I hope to clobber them to remove from their mind the picture of themselves as getting out of life just by dying. And I have a slogan that I use from my Book of the Dead translation and my book called Infinite Life, where I get into this. And I'm going to debate Dennett. I want to debate him down here where Lincoln debated in the old days down at the Pratt Institute. And that is that, there's no getting out of here. No one will ever get out of here a dead. You know the English expression, no one gets out of here alive? Yeah. No one gets out of here a dead. That's my slogan. In other words, they're not going to get out. If they wreck this planet, the industrial, technological, scientific people with their materialism and totally destroy this planet with their nuclear weapons and their pollution and their industrialization and their resource depletion and their species extinction and their genetic screwing up of the crop systems, then they're not getting out of it. They're going to be reborn as a bunch of weird, genetically mutated lizards. Tough luck, you know.
I remember traditionally there is a similar hesitance to speak about emptiness, right? Because traditionally it was said that there's a risk that people will fall into nihilism.
Right. Exactly, that's exactly right.
Which is a similar dynamic, of course. And I remember you stepping over that hesitance because you argued, well, most Westerners are nihilists anyway, so there's nothing to lose.
That's right. How
is
did
that
you remember that?
A similar reasoning?
That's a similar type of reasoning in a way, in a reverse direction. And but it relates to something actually that I think is very important. That I often, when I give Tibetan lectures in Tibetan, in Tibetan sites in India or Bhutan or Ladakh or Nepal, I always argue to the monks. Or the ex-monks, you know, the sort of elite intelligentsia, that they have to give up this two-tiered system in Buddhist society where they think that the lay people, you just teach them about morality and karma and giving gifts and behaving themselves and, you know, going to the monastery on a holiday. And then it's the monks who learn about Madhyamaka and this and that. Because with the universal Western education that the Tibetan lay people are getting, they're getting materialism and they're getting Western philosophy and Western so-called scientific dogmatisms of materialism, and you have to give them the intellectual tools to defend their minds from those worldviews, those logta, as we would call them, wrong worldviews, and you have to share more of the Tibetan Buddhist worldview with them. And they aren't capable of doing it. And I got this strongly on this view from my experience of teaching some few Tibetan sort of elite members of Tibetan refugee community who would occasionally come to my college classes and learn in English Tibetan philosophy. And then when they would go back to Bodh Gaya or somewhere, Dharamsala, and they would try to talk to Geshe-la, he wouldn't even want to discuss with them some Tibetan philosophy book because he couldn't imagine they'd read it. Because he sees them as a layperson who should just be bringing tea. And when they do discuss, and they don't know the Tibetan terminology because they studied it in English. But they can very well understand it. Maybe they don't contemplate, maybe it's not as deep as the Geshe who studied and debated for 10 years, but they do understand it. And so that's a different direction, you know. Okay. Well, Alan's talk stood out for me because I do love the way he brings up James, and I love the way he brings up Searle, and he shows, and his whole thing about first person, you know, subjective science. That's always listening to Alan is always a high point for me. Although I demur from the strategy that I think he's ruling himself out of success by not adopting this other strategy. And I think he, on this esoteric level, let's say, talking to scientists. And I want to improve his methodology so he can get there where he wants to go. And so that's a high point for me. Flanagan's paper, particularly his discussion, informed discussion about the interaction between karma theory and Darwin, which is more in his footnotes in a way. But his whole discussion of that, I really liked that paper. And actually, I missed his talk, unfortunately, but I read the paper, and I really liked that. That was a high point for me. And what else? I liked my talk. Just kidding. And but everybody's heard my talk before, so it's not a big thing. But I liked trying to remember. Those were, I guess, the two really high points for me in the discussion. And coming up on the ethics, I'm going to get very excited about, and the meditation. I like it all, actually. And I love seeing all the friends. And one thing I noticed that was a high point for me when I gave my talk, and I think that's why I liked my talk. Not that just I don't even hear what I say myself, but the people who are here, this audience, coming from New York on a Sunday at 8:30 in the morning or on Saturday all day, there's a very sweet group of people. I know many of them, but many I don't. And they are, the fact that there's such a strong interest and they're so pleased that a place like an institution like Columbia is coming out of its hidebound academic divisions and things and is entertaining such a conference, I think is a real delight to them. And they were a delight to me to see the sort of looks on their faces and the idea that there should be discussions of great moment and of great academic and intellectual import conducted on these campuses, you know what I mean, and therefore breaking the duality between things that are of vital interest in life and what is merely academic. You know, I was very delighted and pleased by that. And that was a high point for me, in the sense that's when I was giving the talk, and then therefore looking and engaging with the faces of the people. I thought that was marvelous. I thought they are marvelous. The audience is marvelous. And another high point for me is meeting you, and you're doing this book, and getting and discussing how to bring the mind and life to the next level, and get beyond this excessive dependence on His Holiness personally, which is, it's a burden on him. And it is underappreciating the value of the Tibetan intellectual, scientific, and even academic tradition. So that's what I would say at this point.